Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and community advocate Gemma Sotomayor. And we are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find my personal social media handle as at Don Eduardo Barca on Instagram. All right, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. Right, Andy, please share with us the topic of today.
Yeah, so a few weeks back, first off, congratulations, Gemma and Eduardo, for your doing your own solo episode. And I really enjoyed editing it and listening to it. And people should check it out. It was good. It was last week's episode. I was not able to be there. Secondly, about 3 weeks ago, we did an episode where Tucker Carlson had interviewed this guy named Mike Benz and about censorship and about the censorship state and things like that. One of the major themes that me, you, Eduardo, and Kenny, who was with us then on that episode, talked about was how what was really exposed for us in that was the central role of the Department of Homeland Security in developing the security state. This is so the security state that the freedom movement is so concerned about. Well, that same freedom movement has been welcoming or has been inviting that same state to secure its borders, which basically means strengthening the Department of Homeland Security. And we were trying to point out that contradiction. And I at certain points was outraged by certain things, still frustrated with why the freedom movement doesn't just say, look, why should workers not be free to move anywhere? And I think I threw out a challenge of like, well, somebody please, tell me how we're wrong here, And one of our one of our viewers actually did write a letter in response and said why they were opposed to open borders. And I sent it to you all, and I told the person, hey, we'd like to share that letter and respond to it because we think it would maybe help clarify where we're coming from and just continue the discussion. So that's what today's episode will be. We're going to see the letter that this person wrote. We'll all give our responses to it, and we'll see where this conversation takes us. Because I think there may be some parts that are clarifying. Hopefully, it clarifies it for the person who wrote the letter, like where we're coming from. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll agree, but it will be clarifying. And I don't know where Gemma and Eduardo hang on some of these points that the person raises, so I'd like to hear from them as well.
All right. I should we read that letter?
Yeah.
That response to our. By the way, anyone can write to us.
Yeah.
And he always responds. He's so good with that, and you can find it on what'sleftpodcast.com.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, and we actually, I kind of do hope that more people do take the opportunity to try to write to us, and maybe we'll have many episodes that are like this about different issues that we take up. So that's another reason I like to do this, because I would like to encourage more responses from our viewers.
And while you pull it, Lipson, just to clarify too, we did get permission. I know you stated, but just because I do want people to feel comfortable that if you guys want to write something, but you don't necessarily want it to be on air, that doesn't mean we're going to blast you. Like, we'll get your okay before we do respond, react.
Well, okay, yes, certainly, I agree. I agree with that. All right, let's see. Share screen. You can all see the letter then?
Yes.
All right, I'll read it out for us. You asked for a different viewpoint on open borders. I'll gladly express mine. In my view, open borders is colonialism. Open borders and mass immigration was a weapon used by the British Empire in places like Sri Lanka, Fiji, Singapore, and South Africa, and countless other areas to dilute the local culture and make them easier to conquer and subjugate. In fact, what was the arrival of Europeans in America, Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii anything other than an announcement of an open borders policy? No doubt the indigenous people in those areas did not want open borders, but it was forced upon them. The globalists are using the same weapon against the current American culture to dilute it and weaken it. I live in Japan, and this country has a unique and rich culture. They are also excellent and kind hosts to guests. However, they are a deeply xenophobic society and strictly control their borders, as they instinctively understand that a mass influx of people with a different norms, values, and beliefs would dilute Japanese culture until it became part of the global blob culture of nothingness. The globalists want open borders because they want to eliminate all cultures, including American culture. What is Israel imposing on Gaza other than an open borders policy? Telling the people who live in an area that they have no right to control who enters their space and their communities. All cultures have value, including American culture, and cultures have right to protect themselves, just like a family has a right to lock their door and control who comes in and out. In conclusion, I would also like to state that to insist that there are only two options, open borders or a DHS police state, is a fallacy. Borders can be controlled without the need for a DHS at all. Every other country does it without biometrics. I think if you were to poll the vast majority of the so-called freedom movement, they would simply ask that border control be reinstated in the same manner as normal countries have been doing for hundreds of years. Treat the country in the same as a family treats a house. Guests are welcome, but there is a door and with a lock, and the family choose who enters and how long they are allowed to stay. Unless by common agreement, the guest becomes a new member of the family. And that was it. So you can clearly see from the letter that this person is racist and should be canceled and being against immigration.
Oh, Lord. Done. That's it, folks. That's the episode. Thanks for tuning in.
Oh, I wanted to say that. I knew I wanted to say that sometime during the episode.
I don't know if you should leave that.
No, it's going to stay.
We're leaving it. I can't be the only one here saying outlandish things.
No, obviously I'm making a joke, but because that's how people respond when we disagree about these things. So that's it. That's their letter. And I'd like to see what people have. What sort of things came up? Areas you agree, areas you disagree, and we'll take it from there.
Right. I think. Well, who wants to go first? Sorry.
You started. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that. There's a difference when people want to migrate, right? People want to migrate to different areas. And I don't really mind if Europeans wanted to go seek a better life, if they wanted to in South America, or if they wanted to go to Africa. Like, they could have just done that. There are many Europeans who probably had to flee for different reasons. I mean, that happened with many pilgrims. I mean, they left from England to the USA. Part of the story, not completely, but that isn't so much my issue. And there will be conflicts. Obviously, there will be conflicts. There will always be conflicts in history because there are just differences in thought, differences in culture, and sometimes some people do have good intentions, other people have bad intentions, and that will naturally happen. You're going to have to fight people who are trying to have these horrible intentions and trying to destroy a tribe or even trying to do something malicious to a group of people. I think it's different, though, when you have royalty as European colonizers at that time. That's why I called them colonizers, because it wasn't just people like workers wanting to move. It was a state wanting to take over another place and to establish further their empire, which is different from workers or people wanting to move from one place to another. And we see that happening many places. So if people want to compare the state, right, like a governing class, a governing body of people, saying we want to further expand our territory, we want to further expand our empire, we want to further expand the monarchy or a capitalist state, then that's a whole different issue, because then we're discussing how there are nefarious intentions in trying to govern over other people, right? Whereas if you have a white person trying, I'm going to say this because I think what he's using is, it's interesting, sort of trying to take part from the left, the progressive left, like, wait, hold on, this is bad because you all said colonization is wrong. And look at all the indigenous people have been used. And that's true. That has happened. But I don't have an issue. I've never had an issue with anybody. I mean, in my country, right, there's so many white people retiring in San Miguel de Allende in Mexico. Like, these things aren't issues for me. The issue that I have is when you have what sometimes people might even hear me. I'm not sure if I said it, but I say it here in Colombia. The issue I have is how come it's not reciprocated? How come white people can, or U.S. Americans, they have to be white people. I've seen African American people also move to Mexico, and so why is it that they can retire in Mexico and Mexican people or other Latinos cannot retire in the USA, right? Like, it's not reciprocated. It's not mutual. It's not able. It's not equal in that sense. I don't know what other way to say. So I think that's the first thing I want to say, and then let you all say your thing, and then we can further continue on with what's been said there.
So I agree with you. That was actually the first thing when I read that paragraph that came to my mind is there's a difference between a family or a group set of people migrating and a state choosing to conquer, to pillage, to take over its resources, and they do it for that purpose. So when this person is saying colonialism, imperialism, it really is that. It really was the crown saying, I'm going to pay, I'm going to fund, send all the people, kill, and bring me back riches. That was the goal. It was a completely different intent than what we say when we speak of open borders. Now, in the episode that I spoke about open borders, again, I'm not one for completely demolishing the borders. I do think there still needs to be, to what the our viewer was saying, there can be a middle ground. That's kind of where I lean. I still think that my middle ground is far closer to open borders than what their middle ground is. I also want to point out that before, like, I don't know if it was during the Roman Empire. So, but borders as they existed were natural borders. It was mountain plains, it was oceans, it was a natural thing that divided countries. And there was just maybe one little area where people would be able to cross from one country to another. And it was done strategically in a manner that people can cross, but your military can't cross. If your military tries to come in, then my military will intervene, right? Which would, I would assume that most countries nowadays, if we do open borders, would do something like that. If I see you approaching with tanks, with a whole army, military, I'm gonna stop that. Which would be our current day version of colonialism back when the Europeans landed in America and destroyed the Native Americans. So they're not one and the same. We have to look at the current our current world and how it operates and just be able to apply it to current world, not use previous history from it. Learn from it, don't get me wrong, but it's not one and the same.
It is certainly true that this history of British imperialism and U.S. imperialism and all these empires were constructed on the basis that they would define their borders. Those countries would define their borders for themselves and then penetrate other people's borders, either militarily, and that was mostly prior to World War II. And then after World War II, the border penetration became more capital. It was less about troops entering your borders, crossing your borders. It became more like so-called free trade, using basically the ability to tear down trade restrictions, protections that countries had for their industries, and basically eliminating those, and then setting up a situation that was good for Western capitalist Western capitalist industries and things like that. So, and then of course now we are once again in the phase of, I would say, certainly since the first Gulf War to the second Gulf War, the U.S. has tried to reacclimate the U.S. citizenship to the idea that, no, we're going to use troops on the ground, boots on the ground, to smash other people's borders and take what we want from them and take their resources and use them for what we will. But that's not what is meant here by, well, at least, and I'm going to say from, I think, me and Eduardo, because I'm not sure how much you are on the same page with us on this, but when me and Eduardo say open borders, we are not celebrating the right of our state to smash all the borders everywhere else. In fact, it's the opposite. I am not saying Mexico has to have open borders. Russia has to have open borders. China has to have open borders. In my opinion, that is for the workers in China and Mexico and Russia to fight for. And I do believe for workers to be liberated in those countries, they will have to dismantle their own state. And part of dismantling their state is going to be no longer giving the state the right to secure its own borders. And what I'm doing is, and what I'm advocating for, is not just an open borders policy. I'm advocating for a no border policy. I want to eliminate my state's ability to use its control of the border to control workers outside the country. And obviously, I believe that they're using that same thing to control workers inside the country, because like I've said before, they don't use the border to preserve culture. They don't use the border to protect jobs. They use the border to control the movement of workers, both externally and ultimately internally, as we saw, because we saw how they use passports as a vehicle for saying you can exit the country, you can't exit the country, not just for people outside the country, but for people inside the country, so-called citizens. We saw that being used during the COVID period. And so when I talk about open borders, it's because I want to eliminate I do not want to allow my state to do anything, to develop any sort of control infrastructure, which will always be something militarized, something weaponized. I want to take that weapon out of their hands, because that state is not just going to use that weapon against Mexican workers or Guatemalan workers or African workers or Canadian workers. Ultimately, it uses, and this is what the point of Mike Benz was saying. The DHS was all its tools were being constructed to be used for internal control of workers here. And I know he says, the person who wrote this says that it's not either the DHS or something else, but that's not true. It is. When people talk about securing the border, they're making that invocation to the state, and when they do that, that's going to be the Department of Homeland Security. We do not have a worker-controlled government here. We do not live in, and this is the last not the last, but the other fallacy. We are not a family in this country. We are not. It's not like Biden, Trump, our dad, mom, and dad. And I don't mean to say just in terms of, like, our rulers are not our parents. They are our rulers, and they rule over us, and they exploit us, and they use their rule over us to enrich themselves. That's not a family. It's closer to a prison, like with them being our wardens. And if you allow them to strengthen the walls of their prison, that's not just going to affect people outside the prison, it affects people inside the prison. So I think this notion that that's probably the biggest fallacy I see in this, is that somehow, and I believe this person is probably aware that there's the fourth industrial revolution and all the things that have happened over these last years that have proven how much our rulers hate us and want to destroy us. Those rulers need to be disarmed. And disarming them is going to be a precondition towards us having our own true freedom in this world. And that will not come about unless we eliminate, well, in this case, what I'm talking about in terms of the United States, eliminate the US state's ability to exercise control of its border, because I know in doing so, it's not just going to control the lives of workers outside, it's going to control our lives as well. And if we're going to be for freedom, we need to be for the free movement of all workers anywhere. And that's a precondition, one of the preconditions towards a truly free world.
I'm not sure. Maybe some people are part of the freedom movement where their idea of an economic.
Eduardo, if you wouldn't mind, do you think, because we never really talked about this, do you agree with the way I characterized? Because I know Hema doesn't necessarily, but when I say it's not just open borders, but it's like no borders, is that also what you think as well? Because I don't think we've necessarily.
I do. I mean, let's go back to COVID. Let's just use that for an example. That people can see me on What's Left having said that I do believe that we should take precautions. We should be careful about COVID. And then what happens? It's like if we give leeway or some sort of credency or something for people like in government to for our fear to be exasperated by what they wanted to do with COVID. We see how people took advantage of technology and advancements of emergency powers being used, and also ways to control people, even though it didn't make any sense. So, and then I've changed my position on that over time, and I think people can see that that's fine. And what's left, I like people to use me as how I evolutionize my positions. And so maybe at one point I had thought, I think as Gemma, as we had talked about in the last episode, maybe at one point I had thought maybe we need to have some sort of security measure just so people can ease their fears. But I've come to the conclusion that, as you've said, there should be no borders, because it's not what Gemma idea of security measures are. It's what people who have the power to enforce those security measures will do with that sort of allowance or desire, or maybe it's not. If Gemma was ruling it, maybe I'd trust Gemma because I know her as a friend, and she would just check in someone's bag and like, okay, go ahead and move forward.
You would vote for me.
She's still pissed about that.
But then we're talking about you can't have multiple Gemmas along the border and have those security checks. Obviously, there would be people taking advantage of that. So the issue I have with that is what we saw with COVID. You give a little bit of this much power, and you say, "Oh yeah, sure, run with it," and you have a match that lights a whole forest. So for me, the issue now will be it's going to be enforced. So I'm sorry, but this person who wrote to us, and I appreciate them writing to us, and people should be encouraged to write to us. We're not going to attack this person. We're having a friendly debate here, but there is no future in that way of thought. There is no liberation in that way of thought. There's no freedom in that way of thought. People need to understand that there will always be a way to take fully advantage of that. And we're talking about differences in where we're at today from before. And I'm not, I don't agree with it either way then. Borders, where we're at now is not, as you said, Andy, isn't to protect people. It's a control of capital. It's a control of movement, where corporations say how things are managed. There's open borders for corporations. There's open borders for rich people. The wealthy class they don't have restrictions. You got money, you can go anywhere. So yeah, I do agree. Gemita.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're ready to move to the second part of the letter, because this is something that we talked about and I poked fun at, and it was the United States doesn't have a culture. I don't believe the United States has a culture. To which Lipson replied that there's a myth. There's a myth of the melting pot. There's a myth of send us you're weak, you're tired, you're poor. And that's the culture of the United States, right? It's the American dream. And he kind of alludes to that by saying that we have the right to defend our American culture. He also alluded, or she, I don't know, I keep saying he, but I don't know. Also alluded to Japan. So if you guys don't mind, I'd like to kind of touch upon some of those things.
Go for it.
I was born in the United States. I was raised in Nicaragua. I identify as Nicaragüense. I practice the Nicaraguan culture. I'm part of a nonprofit organization that promotes Nicaraguan culture. And those around me, even though we're in the United States, we are very heavily living our Nicaraguan culture. Is that imposing it on Lipson, who's American and is very close to me? I have not once seen Lipson talk or do our dances or necessarily partake. You've gone to some of our events, but more than anything as support, not as in me forcing you to adopt my way of culture and you losing your own. Eduardo, same thing with you being Mexican and you're a very proud Mexican. I have not once felt the need to partake in Mexican culture, and I don't see you forcing that on Lipson either. So the fact that I migrate with my culture and I take that with me, it doesn't impose it on anyone. We are free to act and to do and to believe the same way in religion, the same way in voting in politics. I don't see how that is forcing it. I do see a problem with idolizing countries like Japan that are very closed off and even they said xenophobic, because look at Japan. Japan has a high rate of suicide. And also Japan has a big problem with population, people leaving the country, going to places like the United States. Now you can argue, well, they're doing it for financial reasons, but you would also make the same argument for a lot of like the Mexican population and Salvadoran and Latin American, where we migrate to the United States for financial reasons, but we come back home. We send money back home. We have our roots back home and our thing is going back home. And from my understanding in Japan, Japan has a problem with empty cities, vacant homes. So I see a problem with idolizing. There's nothing wrong with being proud of your heritage, and Japan has very rich history and culture and should definitely be respected, and they should practice it. But you don't stop being Japanese because you move. You can live in Japan your entire life and not partake in any of the Japanese traditions. I see it in Nicaragua too. I see a lot of people in my country that have never left the country, but they don't, if you ask them about some of our traditions or some of our culture, like our history, they don't know. Ultimately, it's up to you as an individual, and migrating doesn't change that. We don't migrate for culture, we migrate for financial reasons.
Yeah. Should I go from there, Eduardo? Or you want to go?
No, do you have something very eminent pending to say?
No, I would just say something to it, but go ahead if you want to say.
Go ahead. Why don't you?
Yeah, that I think the question that was raised, and I'm glad that the person who wrote the letter brought up this question of culture, because it's definitely a point that is raised here. And I agree with you, Hema, that people who come from a given culture who move into places that might have a different culture are not invading a culture. They're at best they're going to share theirs potentially, and they're going to experience a different culture, and possibly over time there might be a shift in both cultures at that location as a result of cross-pollination. And you may have, and we see this in music, we see this in cooking and in food, we see this in theater, and we see it in the arts. It is a cross-pollination experience, not a like keep your thing out. And that to me is actually something very human and something to be welcomed. Now, in a free society, if people wanted to keep themselves away from other people, I would say that that's fine. But we don't live in that free society. We do live in a capitalist monoculture that's essentially putting Trader Joe's and Kmart's and Walmart's all over across the United States, all over China, all over Japan. A capitalist monoculture that is going to use Japan as an occupied country by the United States as a military bulwark against China. The reason Japan is militarizing is because the United States runs that country and is going to attempt to use Japan to fight China rather than, I do know that Japan and China actually have a past of conflict, but the United States is certainly going to take advantage of that and make that so-called respected culture that has been actually already invaded and already subdued by this culture, the United States, but not our culture, by the US government, by the US state. And to actually free Japan, to actually liberate Japan, the best thing that could happen is for the US state to be taken down, its borders eradicated, it's incapable of securing its own borders, let alone putting invading armies and occupying armies in other states. So I think it's like I would ask that person to think about their understanding of culture when they are living in a country occupied by the US state, and think of it as Japan. It isn't Japan. It's a US colony going to be used as a buttress against China. Now, I get that there are things you can see there, and you can see Japanese letters, and you can see a language and things like that. But all of that right now is subject to US control, and the US gets to decide how those people are going to use their state. So the thing I would say then is that culture to me does exist, but people actually moving from culture to culture, to me, doesn't imply any threat unless there's a state behind that, unless there's a state coming in with it, and then it is a threat. And that's already happened in Japan. There has been a culture that came in and occupied you, and it does occupy you, and it's called the United States of America. And I would invite the person who wrote the letter to see the irony of wanting that same state, which is occupying Japan and using it, and it's willing to destroy all of Japan in a nuclear, fireball, because that's going to be the first place where China is going to be taken on. That they would want to preserve the U.S. state, which is actually spreading its tentacles everywhere, including Japan. Like that to me seems like a contradiction.
I don't think any culture has not evolved. Every culture has evolved, and every culture has been a fusion of things. I mean, I did my DNA test a long time ago now, and I kind of regret it now after we spoke to Alison. So now I will always be tracked, and feel awful about it. But my percentage is not that high as being indigenous Mexican. I have Spanish Basque blood. I have Italian. I have French. I have even Scottish. That's like 2%, but mostly like Italian and French. And so, what happened was lots of Europeans went to Latin America and cross-pollinated with other people from indigenous tribes, and culture was meshed. What we eat in Latin America, a lot of those animals and livestock didn't exist in Latin America, and we've now have it in part of our culture. And I see now with immigration, the highest immigration in Mexico today, we have Venezuelan children being born in Mexico. They have Venezuelan parents, but they speak Mexican Spanish, and they eat arepas and tortillas, and you now it's complete fusion of cultures. And we have lots of Colombians living in Mexico, and Haitians, and I have a friend who is half Black Haitian, and his mother is Mexican, and then the fusion of culture there, and you have lots of Latinos living together in the USA. And anyhow, so I guess what I'm just trying to say is, I was once living. I speak French, and I've lived in France, and I'm still happy and proud to be Mexican, but I've adopted lots of things in a French society living there. But I remember one time living with a family, and they said to me, "Oh, Eduardo, I just want to tell you this." And I said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." And it's like, so many Muslims, so many Arabs are living in France. It's like, what will happen to the French culture? And I said to her, I remember saying this to my other French friends, and they said, alongside with me, they said, "Well, what was the French culture? It's always changed. It's always evolved." Way back, Normans, in the day of the Normans, it was, what was it? Because it's evolved. And so I think that if we become, I've often said I'm proud to be Mexican. Of course, I pretend to be a nationalist, but in reality, we are a fusion of so many other cultures. I'm here in Colombia, where I'm at, and as much as I try to stick to my accent and to my words and my usage and my way of culture, it's hard not to immerse yourself and to adopt things and to learn to live with other people. And I eventually don't even see myself as being Mexican. I just see myself as just being a part of someone who's living here, but that happens, and it's natural that people want to preserve parts of their identity. We have to kind of move past them, because our identities are keeping us fighting. Look at Gaza. So if we hold on to our identities, we can be proud of a lot of things, but we also have to see where it leads us. So I'm concerned when this person is saying, American culture diluted. American culture has only been developed. People say there is no culture in the USA. I do think there is a culture. There is some sort of culture there. It's different. But U.S. American culture was only developed after so many years of the country having been, as a society, as being the USA, as a state. It is a young country, but it has happened over time. The xenophobia, we're never going to move past. We're always going to be infighting if we keep having xenophobia, as the Japanese, as this person says. I don't think every Japanese is xenophobic, but I know what xenophobia is. Here in Colombia, there's so many xenophobia towards Venezuelans in Mexico, towards Central Americans, and now Venezuelans and Colombians. And I don't think we should, that's the way for us to go, because that's what's keeping, people at the top to control the rest of us to be divided. And I'm really concerned for people in the freedom movement to continue, if they don't disavow it, we have to live together. We have to try to fuse our lives together and share parts of our lives together with other people. And if I adopt something from Nicaragua, when I was there in Nicaragua, I remember Saul loving to use the accent there and to speak Nicaraguan, and he was there even though he's Mexican to the core. But what, I never said anything to that. It's lovely to see that. It's great to see that. It's wonderful that we could just be one and we're just one human, race. I just don't think that this is going to work. So
hold on.
Right.
Can you, Eduardo? Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, I was just saying that the way to go is no borders, and just see us as humans, really, and still be proud of the diversity of what we are and where we're from.
I have what is known in Spanish as sentimientos encontrados, and I don't know how to translate that in English, but I do think that there is something to be saddened about when cultures mix, and not because I see it as a negative, because it's natural. Language evolves, beliefs evolve. It's natural for it to happen, but I would also be lying if I didn't say that it saddens me a little bit to see some of the traditions be lost along the way, because that is what makes me Nicaraguan, And so I do understand where this viewer is coming from in that part. I do think that while I don't agree with either of you three that the United States has a culture, um, I do believe that it still is sad that what you perceive as culture, what you would call as your own culture, to see it in his own words diluted, or their own words diluted. Um, so and I don't know, I just did want to put that out there because, again, well, I know it's natural, it's a natural thing to happen. We're all going to evolve. Like, studies have said that we were all going to look the same. Like, I think we're all going to be brown. And I don't know if you guys have seen that this is what human race is going to look like 100 years or 1,000 years from now, after all the migration. And it's kind of like, oh my God, we're all vanilla. It's all the same. And I don't like that. I like my box of crayons. I like colors. I like differences. I'm sorry. I do. And I do fight for that. I do fight for, be like, no, you're Nicaragüense. This is what we do. Yes, Mexicans have the Day of the Dead, and that's beautiful, but we have All Saints Day. It's the following day. We also have our own traditions, and it's saddened that we don't get to share that with our people, and then it gets lost. But I just wanted to put that because I do empathize. I do kind of agree with the viewer on that one point. But fuck American culture. Culture.
I think if you go to the Appalachians and hear the music played up in Vermont, New Hampshire, the hills there, and if you go to New Orleans, where I'll be traveling to, you are going to see very different foods, very different musics, very different ways of talking. It'll be English, but it'll sound very different. There are a variety of different culture. We have heterogeneous cultures within the United States. And it's true, like what was Tucker Carlson was talking about, being in Moscow and saying how many different cultures were in Russia. It's true all over the globe that because of travel, there are many different cultures, and there is an interpenetration of them, but they really do exist. And I do believe there is culture in the United States. And then there's something more common. One could call it, one could wonder if like American football is part of our culture. I do think it is, and that might cover a greater section of the part of the United States. But there's just, I just think there is culture in the United States. And there are different areas where there's unique cultures within the United States. The thing I want to talk about is what the word that, can you hear Gizmo whining in the back? Do you hear him whining?
Just a little bit, but not enough. Not
That's
enough.
fine. All right. Is that word xenophobia? Just, I think it's important to understand what xenophobia is. What is fear of that outsider? But it's not just fear of the outsider. It's it's a belief that the insider is where you're safe. The people on the inside are the people you're safe with. That's the other part of xenophobia, and that's the danger of xenophobia, is to understand that the murder is already in the house, like in those movies. It's the person that you should be most afraid of. The institutions you should be most afraid of are not actually outside your borders. Well, and that's certainly true in the United States. Japan is now a colony proxy army. Now it's going to be a proxy army of the United States. I don't know what to say about Japan right now, but within the United States, within China, within Russia, within France, within Germany, if you think that you're most afraid of something outside of your country's border, then you have fallen for what I would say the most dangerous illusion of all, which is to not understand that the real danger are your rulers that are in that country. They're in your house already, and those are the ones you have to fight. And you can't fight them by giving them weapons to protect you from others, because they're not there to protect you. They are there to exploit you and harm you and use you as a tool for themselves. And they're vampires. They're not parents. And so that, to me, is what we have to understand about xenophobia. My opposition to xenophobia isn't some sort of moral, like, oh, we have to love our brothers and sisters, although I do believe ultimately workers across the globe are brothers and sisters, even if we disagree. But it really is from a position of, we have to understand that if we're going to fight for a better world, we can't put all these tools, all these weapons into the hands of our captors. And that's what we're doing when we engage in what's called xenophobia, because it's the illusion that the things that you're most afraid of are outside your borders, not the ones inside.
I agree completely. That's why I invite Gemma and this listener to the love train, and to join the love Gemma's eyes, to join us with one love, one heart. Let's join together and feel all right,
Get me out.
Oh my God. We might have done some work to try to help convince this person, and that just killed us.
Yeah. Thank you, Eduardo. We'll just edit that whole thing out.
No, we're gonna.
I really do invite people to hop onto that love train.
Yeah.
The thing is, we are proud people, and we have lots to be proud of, and there's lots of diversity, and I'm for one, I hate language changing, especially when it comes to, I speak Spanish as my primary language, and I hate how all these things change, especially when I don't like to change things. But I have had learned to adapt, and I think people in Latin America have taught me that. Living in Colombia, living in Mexico, and it's like hard. I have to, down south, people use vos in Chiapas, and then in Mexico City, it's like no one uses vos. So this is kind of the way that things are. And as to going back to Andy, I look at what's happening with the xenophobia toward the Palestinians. I mean, look what's happening around, and who's using that. It's not because it's a religious war. It's an imperialist war, really, what's happening. It's a way to further expand, U.S.-backed empire in the Middle East. And that's how I see it. Sure, we can say that, and I'm glad you said it should be it's not about a moral issue, and it really isn't. I mean, I think and I hope people do have it in their heart to see the humanity in what we're doing and the awful things that we're doing and keeping people out, and for many reasons. But it's beyond that, as we have said in other areas. And for this person to think that, the DHS doesn't have to be used, and like I said already, it's going to be used. And I don't know where this person stands in terms of like a system of economic system, or how we as a society should function. I'm reading right now El Anarquismo, and I hear from Daniel Guérin, and it's he's an anarchist, and I closely associate myself to that sort of idealism more than socialism, and I don't necessarily believe in states like nations, and the way that like we are functioning today. I personally don't believe that way, and so if you still are locked into that sort of belief, like países, countries, if you're still into that belief, like we run by countries and by governments, then obviously a border functions. It's supposed to be functioning for that reason. But that's why I don't know where this person stands on how they see a society running. Whereas if you do see a real, true freedom movement happening, and that's where I think that this is where I'd like to pitch in for people to start looking into anarchism more than socialism or capitalism. I do think you would then see a true society where people and communities all have to be invested and everyone has to fight and contribute. And wouldn't have, that's why I have a friend here in Colombia. His name is Wilmer, and I'm supposed to do the Spanish podcast with him. And yes, we're trying to get that going, but no one wants to do it with me. And so people are dropping like flies, and I don't want to do it myself. Anyhow, so he said to me that, he said, well, where is an anarchist state? Where is it? Which country is anarchist? Like, that's the thing. There is no anarchist country. There are anarchist communities or people who are closely associated to. And some have failed. The Rojava is one of them, right? Like, they have failed. They try to align themselves with the USA. It didn't work out. So back to what we're saying, and you were saying, actually, it was xenophobia, is you're just going to use xenophobia to further expand, as we're seeing Israel expand with Gaza.
The only thing I want to add is he mentioned the fact about what happened to the indigenous cultures in Australia and here in America. And if you asked me the kind of society that I think would be free, it is closer. I think, I don't know, but I think it will look closer to those indigenous like societies that didn't have borders. And yeah, that was taken advantage of. They didn't have a notion of property rights and things like that. That was taken advantage of by the incoming colonizers. But for humans to live free, I suspect we're going to be living closer to that way than this way of states and passports and papers and registration numbers and data. That's my belief. I don't know, but I think if you ask me what a socialist revolution would be, I think it will need to be that. And how we get there, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Emita?
No. I said my piece.
Well, then mostly I would just want to thank the person who wrote this letter. It definitely gave me, and I think us all here, something to think about and talk about. And hope this was helpful for people to hear about more, to go more deeply into where we're coming from with regards to the issue of immigration, which is, I believe, very prominently being utilized in our elections. But also, I do believe it's connected to making workers' lives worse. I think it's not, in my opinion, it is not an accident that at the very same time when workers in every country are finding their situations becoming more miserable, that the states around them are also saying, well, let us secure the border. Let us make life even more miserable for the people who are out there. I think there's a game being played. And I think people should understand that when the state tells you we're going to make it tough on them, they're going to make it tough on you. And that's what I think is going on.
Yeah. All right. Well, that does it for this week's episode.
Yes.
I invite Hemita and everyone else to join the love train. Watch Bob Marley this in theaters. I watched it. It was really good.
Was it really good?
Liked it. It was all right. Yeah. All right. What's left is a weekly political podcast that's challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests in the episode notes for this episode or on our blog at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast /channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you can't see anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher. Bitchute, Odysee, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes for this episode. Andy will be there. Oh, no, not yet. I'm sorry. On the blog for if you want to write to him, he'll answer. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard, like our friend here, our listener, thank you, or suggest something for us to cover, contact us at our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Gemma Sotomayor and Andy Lipson. Thank you all very much. Check us out next time. Ciao.
Ciao.